All right, perfect. So once again, thank you everybody for joining on this Sunday. We're glad that we have this time and glad to see everybody's faces. These last 2 days, it's been raining and everything. So I hope everybody's doing good. And we have I hope we have a very good session today. So maybe I should just start inviting Glenn. Glenn, can you come on board and then maybe just, I know you planned this and coordinated with everybody, so you have a, you can guide us better. Thank you.
Thank you, General Secretary. Thank you, everybody who is here. Dr. Keith, thank you very much. Thank you, Auntie Namtasha. I refuse to call her Dada Namtasha. She's Auntie. Everybody
Okay.
call her Dada Namtasha. She's Auntie Namtasha. Auntie Namtasha is the one who found Dr. Keith. So very thankful to you. I know I called you, I asked you, I didn't know how you're gonna do it, but you made it happen. Thank you, Nampombe, for giving us that pre-introduction. It was unexpected, but it was wonderful. Thank you. Everybody else, I talked to Mwenyekiti, I talked to Mary, I talked to pretty much everybody here. And we were trying to do this. I remember we did it last year, and the purpose is to bring us Tanzania with our African American brother together. We're trying to understand our background. We're trying to understand that we are one, even though we are separated for, I don't know, 400-year history, but we are one. So one of the things we are trying to do, I think Auntie Namtasha will speak a little bit about too, is that we are one, and we need to understand our history so that we come together and work together. And I hope that Dr. Keith will kind of bridge that gap today. I want to thank Dr. Ruth. I don't know if she's here. She was one of the people who were pushing me to just do it, even though some people, they feel like, maybe it's not for us. But she was telling me, her and Sister Namtasha were like, hey, we have to do it. We cannot not do it. And so for my part and my partner communication department, we appreciate everybody who is here. We appreciate the support, and we hope that we'll get even more people here today and we can learn something about our connection, our roots, and how we are connected to African American and their history, and our history is one history. I won't go to many details. I want first to welcome our president so he can do like an official opening. But before I do that, I think maybe our secretary can do her little prayer thing. She always does that when we have a program. So please, maybe
Oh boy.
you and one other person, and then we can go to president.
Yes,
Karibu.
maybe me, Kakayasa there can do it. Okay. Thank you, Glenn, for that introduction. Alrighty. Heavenly Father, we thank you. We give you glory and honor at this hour. We thank you for this meeting that will enrich our community, our understanding, and bring us closer together. We thank you for everybody that has taken time to prepare it. And as we continue with discussions and questions and answers and in our conversation today, we commit everything into your hands. We ask that you guide us and help us understand and continue to build us together as communities, as friends, as relatives, brothers and sisters, and as we continue to live here in Southern California. We continue to ask for your strength and protection as we end this month, Black History Month in February, as we end and as we go to another month, we continue to ask for your protection for ourselves and our family, those who are here and those who will join us later and who will view this discussion later on. In your Father name we pray. Amen.
Asante.
Thank you.
Mnanisikia? Okay.
Thank you.
So karibu President mwenyekiti Dr. Mlanzi.
Can I have everybody, let me take a picture. George is
Nimesikia Dr. Mlanzi. Oh my God.
President.
Bado kuna bachela moja mbele. Anyway.
President and mwenyekiti.
Bahati mbaya sitaonekana. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Mr. Grain, for such introduction. Actually, it's a great pleasure for me to be part of this discussion and to have a chance to introduce great people like Dada Namtasha and our guest speaker today, Dr. Keith, who is going to talk to us about the Black History Month in connection with Africa, actually. This is the subject in which we all should be deeply interested because it's focused on African and how African contributed to the entire history and culture of this Black History Month. So Sina Mengi, thank you so much, Mr. Green and the communication department for good preparation for this kind of discussion. Naomba nimkaribishe Dada Namtasha. Tuendelee kuenjoy madini.
All right, thank you so much. And I am going to speak in English because Dr. Keith Claybrook is still learning Swahili. All right, Nampompe, you did a great job of giving us an overview of your own homework on Dr. Claybrook. But before I add a little bit more, because his bio is long, I want to apologize, Dr. Claybrook, for the tardiness, because we are about 20 minutes from the time we were to start. But as you know, CPT, Color People Time, CPT, I think you are aware of that, aren't you? But nonetheless, we need to apologize for everybody who came on time and we are starting late. We're going to keep doing better. So Dr. Claybrook is a colleague, he's a friend, and indeed he is family to the Bunting family. I met Dr. Claybrook at Loyola Marymount University, where we were both pursuing our graduate degrees. Prior to that, and during that time, I think he was my husband's student because my husband, Dr. Bunting, was a professor at Loyola Marymount University. So I won't speak much more on that. Other than that, I know Dr. Claybrook very well. Before he married his lovely wife, Candace, I used to babysit their children when they were little, and he just informed me that the young boy I was babysitting is now in college, first year. Time goes fast. That's when I was Dada Namtasha. And the name stuck. So Dr. Claybrook is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Cal State University, Long Beach. He teaches history and social sciences there. And among the many responsibilities he has besides teaching is that he's an advisor to the Black Student Union, Black Business Student Association. He serves on the California State University Long Beach President's Committee on Equity and Change Commission. He regularly attends national conferences where he gives presentations. Among many topics, he does one on African deep thought and critical thinking, which I underline that African deep thought and critical thinking. That's something to ponder over. Nampompe told us he's an author, he's a TV personality, and he did write a book called Building the Basics, which is a handbook for pursuing academic excellence in Africana studies. And I think today, Dr. Claybrook, you are going to really bring in that link, that which links us from the continent of Africa to the diaspora. And that word diaspora, before it was used to talk about us who have come on the airplane. It was used to talk about Africans who were forced out of Africa through enslavement to the Caribbean, to the Americas, and to Europe and the United States of America. They are the African diaspora as well. So this word has been hijacked to talk about us. But at the end of the day, we are all one. We are all an African people. We have all experienced enslavement, colonization, and now we are experiencing neo-colonization. But in the spirit of Pan Africanism, Dr. Claybrook, I welcome you to inform us, and I know this is going to be a very informative session. Karibu, Dr. Keith Claybrook.
Asante sana, Namtasha. Habari gani, everyone.
Nzuri.
I am a bit taken back at the moment with the pre-introduction and then the introduction. There's a smile on my face. You know, in reflecting on all the kind words that's been shared about me. Sometimes people get to sharing my bio. I'm like, oh, who are they talking about? But no, it's me. But it's good nonetheless. And let's see, can I share my screen? No,
Sure,
not yet.
me-
So let me just jump. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I have enabled you, so you can go ahead and share whenever you're ready.
Okay, I see. Great, thank you. So I try to preface, because I know I'll try to be mindful of the time as Glenn, shared with me in one of our previous conversations. I'm going to be mindful of that. But I try to begin any presentation that I do on Black History Month with some context about Black History Month. And I start with February 1st. Why do I start with February 1st? Good question. Glad you asked. I start with February 1st because February 1st, 1865. February 1st, 1865, President Lincoln signs the initial draft of of the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution, which is the amendment that abolishes chattel slavery. So I know we give a lot of attention to Juneteenth, which is important. It's a very important cultural holiday, and I do not want to diminish that at all. But the Emancipation Proclamation does not end chattel slavery. That's a whole different conversation. But you can go back and take a look at it. It says that those who are in the states of rebellion have been set free, not discussing those who are still enslaved in the states that are still loyal to the Union. That's a different conversation. Juneteenth, a cultural holiday, but the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution is not passed until December of 1865. But that process really gets underway February 1st, 1865. And so years later, under President Harry Truman, who was pushed by the organizing of Major Richard Wright, not the writer Richard Wright, but this is another individual, Richard Wright, wanted to recognize February 1st and called it National Freedom Day. So you can do that right now. Look up National Freedom Day, February 1st, National Freedom Day. In a little bit, we'll come up about that. The reason why, for me, that kind of frames the whole conversation around Black History Month, which started as Negro History Week by Carter G. Woodson, and then called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, now called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, because Woodson, who's the second Black person to get their doctorate from Harvard, only second to Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, wanted to highlight and the history and the contributions of Black people, not just to American history, but to the world. And so Woodson himself wrote books. The association themselves did studies, had produced a journal, all these other sorts of things that's disseminating this information. So in starting the conversation around any Black History Month program, for me, with February 1st, places the whole conversation of Black history in the context of freedom. It placed in the context of freedom. And that's where things begin and end for me, is about freedom. So as we give a few minutes of our discussion, can everyone see my screen here?
Correct. We can see it. Thank you.
Okay. So as we begin our discussion of Pan Africanism, really just understanding it as a, with the time allotted here, this is really an introduction. This is really an introduction, and the connection of Black history, African-American history, to that Pan-Africanist history, that Pan-Africanist effort. So again, Dr. Keith Claybrook, as introduced, some of my publications, I'm very interested in intellectual history, as well as activism as a form of learning. I've done a piece, since Natasha brought it up earlier. I'll just highlight an article called "Putting Some Soul into Critical Thinking Towards an approach and process for critical thinking in Africana Studies." I just recently had another article called "African Proverbs, Riddles, and Narratives as a Pedagogical Approach to Develop Critical Thinking." That's been accepted for publication as well. So that should be coming out soon. And then this is the handbook that Natasha mentioned, Building the Basics, where I offer study tips, suggestions, and tidbits and study habits, time management, critical thinking, skilled in critical reading, scholarly writing, working collaboratively in groups, and preparing for quizzes and exams. And although it says for Africana Studies, much of the things that I write in here are applicable across multiple disciplines, multiple courses, but I do have a particular focus on Africana Studies. And I just want to just share some of my contact information. Please feel free to stay connected with me. This doesn't have to be a monologue where I talk, go away, and never hear from each other again. No, please feel free to stay in contact with me, even after the presentation. But just a starting point for us, Pan-Africanism. Pan meaning all, African meaning those who are from or of Africa historically and culturally. This is an important distinction here, because although genetically all people can trace their ancestry to the continent of Africa, but when we talk about African people, if we don't bring in the historical connection, the cultural connection, then there's nothing unique about Africa, African people, and the African experience, right? And so that's part of that definition there. And then ism, an ideology or artistic movement guided by a philosophy and practice. So Pan-Africanism then is an ideology uniting all members of the African world community towards the total liberation of African people. And so when we say the African world community, that includes those on the continent of Africa, as well as those in the African diaspora, the historic, as well as the contemporary African diasporic communities. So 3 broad phases of Pan-Africanism, and I'm going to try to touch real quickly on all of these broad phases. But the first being the anti-slave trade and anti-displacement, the second being African independence, and the third, the Union of African States, which I probably won't. I want to spend most of my time though talking about the first and the second. And in this context of Pan-Africanism, right, there is this shared experience for those of African ancestry who are descendants of enslaved Africans, as Natasha mentioned at the beginning. There's this shared experience and cultural amalgamation of enslaved Africans, which began in the dungeons and through the Middle Passage, that trek, that journey across the Atlantic. And so when people start talking about being multicultural, I often remind people that Africa is culturally diverse. But when we are put into those dungeons and cross the Middle Passage and so on and so forth, that multicultural dimension began even as a Pan-African experience, as a Pan-African phenomena. You had multiple groups of African people who began to amalgamate or share or blend certain aspects of their Africanness, if you will, and becomes part of the early foundations of of African American culture. And so, as Michael Gomez, in his book "Exchanging Our Country Mark" shares, says the means by which they were transported was of such violence, the anguish they suffered of such depth, that their memory was veritably seared into the consciousness of both the African and her America-born progeny. In other words, the devastation of what Marimba Ani has referred to as the Ma'afa, the period, this great disaster, as she defines it and coins it, or as Maulana Karenga and others would refer to as the Holocaust of enslavement, was so violent, not only physically, but culturally, psychologically, spiritually. It was so damaging that whether we are consciously aware of it, whether we have the vocabulary to articulate it, it is seared into the depths of our consciousness. Gomez continues and says that there's at least three things, at least three important factors that we must look at the foundation of this experience. First is that the skin color, recognizing that those who were being captured, those who were being brutalized, were of darker skin. Those who were not in chains, were not being brutalized, the ones who were doing the brutalizing were light or pale or white. So race may be a European concept and construct to create a racial hierarchy. However, the Black or the African understanding of what that meant did not come through understanding what some of these European philosophers and scientists and social scientists were saying. It came from their experiences of what they were being exposed to, what they had to endure. That we people who look like this are going through this experience, and those people who look like that are doing this to us. Oluwado Equiano, in his autobiography, talks about this as well. The second factor that Gomez brings up is the survival of the long sea voyage, this Middle Passage. To survive, Gomez says, required cooperation despite different cultures and languages, and during harsh conditions created strong bonds that existed even after the voyage. This is Pan-Africanism. This is Pan-Africanism. This is multiple people from multiple African communities and cultures who are in a shared experience that have demanded, to varying degrees, some level of cooperation to be able to not only survive, but to still have their descendants be here today to tell their story. And the third is a composite of the first two. So both 1 and 2, it bonds. There's a bonding here over this shared experience of suffering. And then I go a little bit further here than Gomez. It's not only the suffering, which is part of it, but also the strength and the power and the agency to be able to endure and then thrive and struggle against the inhumanity. That's also part of it. So I want to make sure that it's not just the suffering that has bonded the people, but their ability to struggle and victoriously struggle and continuously struggle over shared oppression and exploitative conditions. This gives rise to what some have referred to as a Pan-African culture of resistance, which is a rational refusal of the Africans, a rational refusal of the Africans to be intimidated, not going to be intimidated. That's resistance. Black people's active opposition to European political control, slavery, racism, colonial violence, economic exploitations, systems of inequality, cultural alienation. So that opposition to all of these things, that's a Pan-African culture of resistance. And cultural survival is a culture of resistance, is a Pan-African culture of resistance. The common narrative, unfortunately, is that slavery stripped African Americans of their connections to Africa, but this is historically inaccurate. There's a lot of work that's been done by people like Joseph Holloway, Marimba Ani, and others who look at these what we call cultural continuities. Gomez looks at some of that. Pearson, what's his name? Pearson's first name is not coming to me. Pearson looks at some of this as well, and many others, these cultural continuities, not only in the United States, but also throughout the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, so on and so forth. This cultural survival and this blending is also part of this Pan-African cultural resistance. And so this early Pan-Africanism, we see this in a variety of different ways, right? The revolts in the dungeons, the revolts across the Middle Passage on the ships. These are early phases of Pan-African resistance that required the collaboration against oppression, right? The Haitian Revolution the Haitian Revolution is an example of Pan-Africanism. The Nat Turner Rebellion, the Underground Railroad, the Maroon societies where people will run off into the hills or into the swamps and create their own societies away from the Europeans who were abusing and oppressing. The creation of and the maintenance of African-derived religions, right? Whether it's the Black Church in the United States, whether it's Candomblé, whether it's Santeria, whether it's Vodun, I can keep on going, right? The different dances and music, certain aspects of food and cooking, bringing some of those cultural dimensions, right? So yes, it's the outright physical resistance, but it's also the cultural dimensions as well is also part of that Pan-Africanist effort here that we should be aware of, that we should be mindful of. As we move to, so with Brazil being the last country in the Western Hemisphere to outlaw enslavement, outlaw chattel slavery in 1888. We also know that there's the Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, which essentially carves up Africa and places it in the hands of European colonizers. But there's also a response. There's also a response to that comes in the form of a Pan-African Conference, July of 1900, right, in London. One of the chief organizers is H. Sylvester Williams, or Henry Sylvester Williams, from Trinidad in the Caribbean. 37 delegates, 10 observers, including Anna H. Jones, W.E.B. Du Bois, Anna Julia Cooper. So there's representation from throughout the African world. And this really begins to be the first large-scale attempt to organize an international anti-colonial movement. It also encouraged African unity on the continent and throughout the African world. This led to the creation of a Pan-African Association that had offices in Jamaica, in Trinidad, as well as in the United States. So when we're talking about the institutionalization of the Pan-African movement, we have to start with this Pan-African Conference in 1900. Pan-Africanism is older than the concept. Pan-Africanism is older than the term, but the institutionalization of Pan-Africanism has to begin at least here in 1900. There's also a series of Pan-African Congresses with the overarching objective of developing strategies for the eventual independence of the whole of Africa. And so we have 1919 in Paris, 1921 in London, 1923 in London, 1927 in New York, 1945 in Manchester, 1974 Dar es Salaam, 1994 Kampala. There's been a few years back, this is pre-COVID, efforts to have another Pan-African Congress, and there was some political stuff that was going on there, and I'm still not all quite sure about what happened, so I didn't include it in the list because I'm not exactly sure what all was going on there. But I do think there's some planning for something else coming up this year or next. So in other words, these Pan-African Congresses have continued the efforts of the initial conference in 1900 to keep African people on the same page, to work towards a broader Pan-Africanist agenda in their respective locale. What's another piece that is important here is that two things that are important here. One, representatives from throughout the African world continue to take part in all of these Pan-African Congresses. But then beginning in 1974, we see the first time that these meetings, these Congresses, that they're taking place on the African continent, right? That's important. That's why the 1974 really sticks out. One is the first one in, I hate to use it, the language, but more modern, era is 1974. There's still a lot of people who are alive today who were at the 74 conference or Congress, right, in Dar es Salaam. So that's important, right? On the continent of Africa, and continued efforts, right? And then as I mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois earlier, Du Bois was integral. He attended the 1900 conference in England, and he was an integral part of all of the Pan-African Congresses from 1919 to 1945. One of the things that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois brought was, by this point, he is already a well-known figure, not just throughout the United States, but also different parts of the world as well, given his work with the NAACP, well, first the Niagara movement, then the NAACP, and his writings that he did in the Crisis magazine as the editor, but also the books that he wrote. And I just have a couple here because he wrote several books, but I wanted to look at the ones that Du Bois himself was looking at in engaging the African world or engaging Africa. The Negro is, as I understand it, is the first book that looks to give like a survey of the whole of the African world. That's the continent of Africa and the African diaspora. As I understand it, this is the first book to do that. And then you have The World and Africa, an inquiry into the part of Africa which has played in world history. And then the Encyclopedia Africana, which you have here in the middle. He started the Encyclopedia Africana, but never finished it. But it was finished in 99, 2000, I think it was. This encyclopedia, which has entries by authors from around the African world about the history and related subject matters, art, culture, politics, economics, resistance, government, so on and so forth. And this is an extensive undertaking. Like I said, Du Bois didn't finish it, but he started it, and it was finished basically at the turn of the century. There's no conversation about Pan Africanism without discussing Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois or discussing Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey in the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the African Communities League of the World. Marcus Garvey is from Jamaica, started the UNIA. People refer to as the Back to Africa movement, and but that only tells part of it. That only tells part of it. One, there was a Back to Africa movement before Marcus Garvey. For those of you that are interested, look up Paul Cuffey. Paul, P-A-U-L, Cuffey, C-U-F-F-E, right? Who in antebellum America had his own ships, right? And was working towards taking those Black people who wanted to go to Africa. There were others, but in the interest of time, I'm going to stop and just, Paul Cuffey. And then along with Marcus Garvey, saying, Africa for the Africans, those at home and abroad. That is not unique. He's very much so a man of his time, right? Because they're saying English for the Englishmen, Ireland for the Irish, France for the Frenchmen, Germany for the German. And Marcus Garvey would say that we are the Universal Negro Improvement Association, say Africa for the Africans, those at home and abroad. But if we were to limit Garvey there, then we would miss one of the other major pieces. Garvey understood that most Black people, wherever they are, in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in South America, so on and so forth, are not going to go back to Africa. And he said, but that's fine. He said, but if you take all these millions of people and they had their own trade corporation and trade federation, the Black Star Line, the Black Star Trade Corporation, what would happen if they traded and did business amongst themselves? You didn't have to go through Europeans. You didn't have to go through the Americans. You didn't have to go through these other folks, right? If the Black folks on the continent and those Black folks in the Americas and those Black folks in Europe did business with each other, then not only would they be entrepreneurs, but they would be investing in each other. They would be developing an economy, a global, international Black economy that would be independent from their European oppressor. As I understand it, it wasn't Back to Africa that got Garvey in trouble with the law and deported from the United States and the attack on the UNIA. It was what the trade, the international trade amongst African people, those at home and abroad. It's the international trade and what that would do to the global economy. And they say global economy, but it's a European economy. Is what it would do to that if African people would be in control of their own economy and trade. If we move forward, I'm skipping ahead a lot here to the 60s. The 60s are important I'm not going to talk much about Malcolm X and Dr. King. There's lots of information out there on both of them, their travels to Africa, their meetings with African leaders, their attempts to unite those on the continent of Africa and those who are of African ancestry in the United States. I would like to comment here on Fannie Lou Hamer and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because in the early 60s, I think it's either 62 or 63, members of SNCC, including Fannie Lou Hamer, were invited by entertainer Harry Belafonte to go on a tour of Africa. And so they spent a few weeks, going different places and what have you. And Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, she's an older person by this point, sharecropping. And she says, I had never seen a Black stewardess on a plane. When I saw a man come out of the cockpit who was Black right away, then this meant that it was going to be different from what I had been used to, what had been taught to me. I saw some of the most intelligent people, because I had never in my life seen where Black people were running banks. I had never seen nobody behind the counter in a bank. I had never seen nobody Black running the government in my life. So it was quite a revelation to me. I was really learning something for the first time. This really speaks to me because I remember the same thing when I was on my first trip to Ghana in 2000. We were on Ghana Air. We flew out of JFK in New York and flew to Accra on Ghana Air. Black flight attendants, Black pilots on on Ghana Air. I had never seen anything like that, right? And I'm talking about in 2000, where Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer is talking about this in the early 60s. And to see, everyone, from the impoverished who are lining the streets to heads of state, right? Being Black in the United States and not seeing that, it was really eye-opening, and demanded and required a thinking and a rethinking of what it meant to be Black, of what it meant to be of African ancestry, what it meant to be in the United States, part of a movement, not just for civil rights, as Malcolm X said, but a struggle for human rights, to make sure that our humanity is respected. And you cannot respect the people's humanity if you do not respect their ancestry, right? And so if we take a look at, I want to just highlight a couple that generally do not get highlighted, like this individual here, Khalid Abdullah Tariq Al-Mansour. Then he was known as Donald Wharton, but I'll refer to him here as Al-Mansour. And the African American Association in the San Francisco Bay, Oakland area in California. They started it in 1960, 61. By 62, they were really on their way as not just a study group, which is how they started, but also an activist-oriented group. And he said, we screamed Black people from the top of our lungs. The purpose was twofold. One, by everyone referring to themselves as Black, we programmed the mind to resist the media-induced belief that if your skin is white, you're all right. If your skin is brown, stick around. But if you're Black, stay back. And this was a popular rhyme that many of us, even when I'm coming up in the 80s, that many of us knew. And the representation of Blackness, the representation of Africa and African people were something that we were not to see value, to not see beauty, to not see value in. And so Al-Mansour and the African American Association wanted to address and attack, and as he said, reprogram the people to see that racial dynamic completely different. Then he says, too, Black was widely used on the African continent, and our usage would be one more step towards unification. So even here, what we see is in this second statement is further efforts towards Pan Africanism, further efforts towards linking the struggle right? Not only on the continent of Africa, but also in the 60s, we see the independence movements throughout the Caribbean, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Trinidad, so on and so forth, all throughout the Caribbean. The 60s are also seen as a period of independence movements. And this sort of effort here, a conscious effort to unify the African world. We see from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to the present, this continued interest, this contribute intellectual and scholarly interest in Africa, in African history, in African culture, using them to create different African philosophical and theoretical paradigms and constructs to make sense of the world and our place in it, to be able to redefine ourselves, to recreate ourselves. So there's been countless works drawing upon African history and culture that African Americans have looked in the spirit of Sankofa, which is the Ghanaian term and concept, meaning return to the source. Look to the past to be able to move forward, right? And so much of this is taking place in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then into the present. And I'll end here with Dr. David L. Horn. Dr. Horn, who has been very active in the new millennium in accepting the call of the African Union to create the 6th region of the African Union, that is the diaspora. Those of us who find ourselves in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, in the Caribbean, in South America, right? To accept the call of the African Union to be voting members in the African Union with the initial entry into ECOSOC. I forget what the acronym stands for, but the NGO and cultural element and components, right, within the African Union. And Horn tells us Pan-Africanism is practical, is achievable, and a valid objective, but it will be and must be accomplished through an accumulation of small-scale and large-scale interventions rather than one big ceremonious event. And Horn has been working as a Pan-Africanist since his youth in the 50s and 60s in Florida. Then he relocates to California and continues those efforts. Horn continues that what is needed is applied Pan-Africanism. That is when we combine the ideology and the analytical activism. In other words, we have to do something. Being Pan-Africanist is not just talking all the time and being able to cite this book and that author. It's what work are you doing? What are you actively doing and contributing to African liberation, to the unification of Africa as a continent and the unification of African people around the world? And so that's where we are. And what we see here in this brief presentation is that people of African descent in the United States have been connected in varying ways to the continued struggle for the independence of Africa, have been connected to the continued struggle for the unification of African people, from the point of being captured and brought into enslavement to this very day, February 26, 2023. There are those segments of the African-American population who have contributed to this struggle and continue to contribute to this struggle. So I'm going to pause there. And hopefully we can have some time for some dialogue and further and towards the spirit of further unification of Africa and African people. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was a lot of information. I was taking it in, taking it in. So I appreciated the background. I have a lot. I was connecting dots in my head right now. And as you were talking about, return to, the source, because we have brothers and sisters here in America who have returned to Tanzania. There's a lot of them in Arusha, Zanzibar, who have moved. And I was just at the Pan African Film Festival with the Tasha, and there's a lady who is preparing next year to move to Zambia. So I keep on meeting, here African Americans, and they are all, some who are returning to Africa, whether it's Tanzania or another country in Africa. So just hearing you talking about those, I understand better, the shared experiences, like you were talking, the sufferings, and just basically what we went through, together. Anyhow, let me go ahead and just welcome everybody to go ahead and just chip in as far as if you have any questions or anything. I'm just processing everything right now. So welcome. The floor is open to anybody who wants to speak, or you can raise your hand. Did Tasha have a hand up? Thank you, Did Tasha. Go ahead. Just unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Claybrook, for such a rich historical background of Pan-Africanism. And as Mary brings it to present day, you can see that that experience that you had been talking about is still live, is well and alive today. First of all, I have to say, George and the leadership, the work you're doing is work of Pan-Africanism. I think we have to do better to be more inclusive of other Africans from other parts of Africa and the diaspora to make it even more rich and more lively in the spirit of Pan-Africanism. And as Dr. Claybrook mentioned, in 1974, Tanzania hosted the 6th Pan-African Congress. That is something to really go back and look into that. Why did Tanzania become the host of such an important conference? And Dr. Claybrook, you were saying there has been some derailment in terms of what happens to the next Pan-African Congress. I just wanted to add a little bit more on that because I'm privy to information. The AU, in conjunction with President Museveni, they are organizing for the next Pan-African Congress, which will probably take place in Kampala again, because he wants to fund it. And also, in terms of Pan-Africanism, the African Union has divided all of Africa into 5 regions, and the diaspora is the 6th region. So people like Dr. David Horn are very much involved in that 6th region, which includes Africans from the rest. Now, Dr. Claybrook, my question to you is, what kind of influence did people like Dubois, who you spoke of, Marcus Garvey, how did they influence African leaders such as Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Nyerere in the quest of gaining independence from the colonial powers? Dr. Claybrook?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So it's interesting when studying African liberation movements and looking at many leaders, such as Nkrumah, Kenyatta, and others who studied in the West. Many studied, right here in in the United States. And so being in the United States, specifically being in the West, they were exposed to and being able to be a part of, different communities where a lot of these conversations are taking place, being able to get access to speeches and to books that began to conceptualize African independence. One of the things that was spoken about earlier, I don't remember if I was, anyway, on my master's thesis, one of the things that I did was I did a survey of the educational system in Tanzania, Ghana, and the United States, and the impact of colonial education on African consciousness, and then that post-independence education, and how it changed, how it did not change. And I think one of the things that's important here is that many of them spoke back to Garvey and Du Bois in particular, because they were conceptualizing something that gave them the conceptual starting point to think about, because clearly independence from colonization was not something that was all of a sudden new. They had to come to the West to think about that. That's not like, no, that was already there, right? But you had people for a couple generations prior to who had already been theorizing it, who had already been working towards it. And so I think that's where the important part of it is that Du Bois, Garvey, I can see the brother's face and his name is not coming to me. H. Sylvester Williams, C.L.R. James, and many others were doing was providing concepts, one, and then two, especially with respect to Garvey, the practicality, right? The steps, the organization. Don't forget that the UNIA was an attempt to create an international government, a government of African people in exile. Garvey was president. There was an international president. There was a treasury. There's all these other sorts of things that were established. And so what they were, I think that what they were doing, or their significance, I should say rather, their significance is that they were able to capture the imagination of people like a Kenyatta and a Nkrumah, because you can't, if you can't conceive it, then you can't achieve it, to use a overused phrase, but it makes sense. And so I think that's one of the things why they were so powerful in speaking to and communicating a message, because what Du Bois and Garvey were talking about was not going to work on the ground in these different colonial states. But what they contributed was the imaginative, the conceptual understanding of liberation, what that looks like on a theoretical and on a practical level. I think overwhelmingly, I think that's their contribution, is to get that imagination, stirring, and then along with the imagination, but also the empowerment, feeling empowered by knowing you're not alone in this struggle, feeling empowered by knowing that you are part of an international struggle, feeling empowered by knowing that you have these great minds that have preceded you, that are already working on and in the same direction that you're going in. It's reaffirming. And so I think that's part of the power of what they're doing, is it's on the imaginative, it's on the conceptual level, right? So that's a good question. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dada Natasha. Anybody else? Kaka, yes, I'm not sure if you were speaking. I think you were speaking, and then I'll jump back to Dada Nakadori. Kaka, yes, karibu, we can't hear you. Unmute. Your headset maybe it's not connected.
Yeah. Okay.
Tunakusikia, karibu.
Okay. Asante. I mean, thank you for this Zoom meeting. Is great, and I appreciate all those organized it. We need to have more meeting like this between diaspora and community, so we get to learn each other, we get to figure out things. And I want to ask the brother two things. Number one is the education level in African American, it's for youngster is very bad. If you look at the studies, if you go in high school, it's to the point is except it is scary actually when you think about the future. That what has a community, what is the Pan African has done to improve the situation, because they are the future. And also on top of that, the understanding of what the brothers, what African America have been through, the experience that he has articulated, explaining to us. Many young African American do not understand it. I mean, if you ask 25 years old, if you ask a high school 18 years old, what is slavery? Most of the time they cannot define it. And this is very sad. Okay, that's not only here. Even if you ask African from Africa, if you ask them about slavery, about utumwa, the things is like the chances of repeating itself. Was they say historian that Namtasha, they say historian tended to keep repeating, because people forget about it. So those two things, I wanna the brother to elaborate, to say something about it, because it has been my concern for some time. And the third question is, African American, you have made your effort, your struggle has helped people around the world improve their condition in terms of equality. You did a lot of work in Africa, Thurgood Marshall, Brother Bunchels, and many more. They get involved into the independence of Africa. And other culture has also, imitate the struggle of African America. But if you walk down the street in Mexico, African America, I mean, I don't know what they call it, like a Black Africans or yeah, there's a Black people in Mexico. They're living in a very bad condition, huge, obvious discrimination, and people from Mexico, they come here and they take advantage of what you have worked. And they're nice people, but what have we talked about? Can we talk about this so that we can help change their situation? It's right here in Mexico. So maybe brother can talk about it in, a little bit, please.
All right, that's a lot. That's a lot. That'd be a whole presentation in itself. But it's a good question, right? And so I'll try to keep it brief. Absolutely right. The education system in the United States um, has a lot of room for improvement, right? So the way in which I approach the educational system here is keeping in mind its objective, keeping in mind its purpose, and its objective, its purpose is not to do what you and I are talking about on this call. The point of American educational system is to create workers. Anyone who has some time, go back and study the Americanization movement of the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Americanization movement. The Americanization movement is important because it really informs what American education, compulsory education, required education is going to become. So in the late 1800s, the United States has increased Southern, Central, Eastern Europeans. And all of them continue to have their own loyalty to Italy, Germany, Poland, so on and so forth, right? But where do you have all of them together is in the schools. So the educational system then becomes a tool for the Americanizing of its citizenry, not just in terms of reading, writing, and arithmetic, as we were, told growing up, but also culturally. Also, using as an example, the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning. The Pledge of Allegiance comes about as a result of the Americanization movement to pledge allegiance to the United States. So that means then, it doesn't matter if you're from Italy, doesn't matter if you're from Poland, you're an American. So this is where you are, that's who you are. So you can kind of sever those ties. Now, what does that mean for those of us that are of African ancestry? What that means then is that in the United States, where we have a racial hierarchy that has been in place before the United States was even created, the racial hierarchy allows for people from Europe, people from Asia, people from Latin America to come in at a higher level on the racial hierarchy than those who are Black. So to one of your last points questions about Latinos in general, Mexicans in particular, in a racial hierarchy, they still come into the United States at a higher racial starting point than Black people. Not to mention the fact that in Latin America, they dealt with their own colonial history and their own level of racism. It looks different than the United States, but at the end of the day, it placed the white at the top and Black or indigenous peoples right at the bottom. It's a process called whitening or blanqueamiento. I don't have time to get into it, here, but there's a lot of work, on that. And so there's a color caste hierarchy in Latin America. So folks will come in from Latin America into the United States at a higher level on the racial hierarchy in the United States, but they also have their own color hierarchy, their own color caste system hierarchy that also allows them to see themselves as higher than the Black American. And all of that kind of goes into that analysis of what's taking place here. And then lastly, one of the things that I'll speak on is the role of the curriculum. The curriculum, when many people talk about like the school to prison pipeline, or they'll talk about equity and diversity in schools. They'll talk about all these different sorts of things, but they won't talk about the cultural dimension in the curriculum. And Black folks in the United States have been screaming this at least since the 60s. I know it took place before then, but I'm talking about the screaming in the 60s, right? As a radical moment in history. Because we understood then, as some of us understand now, that the role of education, as I said earlier, is not just the reading, the writing, and the arithmetic, but there's also the cultural affirmation. There's also the sense of somebodyness, as Dr. King says, a sense of somebodyness that you get in the curriculum. And then I can go into a whole thing and talk about the overt curriculum or in the covert curriculum, and how we get and how the curriculum itself plays a role in the lack of preparedness. But I'll end my comments, and and we can continue the conversation if this isn't satisfactory. But I'll end my comments with this. We can, as we talk about, as I mentioned, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, H. Sylvester Williams, and others, Edward Wilmot Blyton and Mary Church Terrell, and I can just keep on, Ida B. Wells, I can keep on going. The overwhelming majority of Black people at this time in the early 20th century, the overwhelming majority are still uneducated in the formal sense, or undereducated, illiterate, excuse me. And so this is being done. So much of what I'm discussing here is being done. It's being led by those who are in the know, so to speak. It is being done by those who have a degree of privilege, so to speak, of having been exposed to this information. And so even today, I'm born and raised in Compton. I still live in Compton. As where I sit right now is in Compton, given this, having this Zoom conversation. And I say it with pride. But I know that although I am aware of some of us in Compton who have done more than play ball, rap, and sing, and then there's others who have done other, dimensions in the criminal element and what have you, right? I know that as a Black man from Compton, there's not going to be a lot of us walking around. But I do understand that many of us who are in this position do feel some sense of not just responsibility, but obligation to make good use with that information that we do have. Now there are those who just say, I'm just trying to get up and out the hood and leave it all behind me, and I don't want nothing to do with that anymore. And that's real. We got some of that too, right? But there are some of us who's trying to still do our part. So it is a continued struggle. There were a lot of efforts in the 60s, a lot of efforts in the 80s and 90s through rites of passage programs and after school programs, and a lot of those things, hey, it takes money to fund a movement, right? And resources that many of us don't have. And so we got to get creative with it, the best way that we can. So there's a lot underneath your questions and your concern, and and I'm there with you. Many of us are there with you. I just hope that what at least my role, I think, in part of this is, along with some of that energy to understand what's happening and do something about it. I hope that my role can be providing context so that we can have informed discussion and informed strategies to address the concerns that I think all, if not that most, if not all of us see, but to address them in as informed of a way as possible. So, like I said, I hope that addresses it. That could be a whole presentation in itself,
Yeah.
but I hope I was able to address some of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think you addressed it very well, and I agree with you. And it's just, I think everybody, if each one of us take participation, and give, explain those cultural affirmations that you were talking about. It's important. I graduated from Cal Poly Pomona last year, and you bet, like, every time they were talking about, Africa, or even Black, how we went through the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, like, I had something to say about it. I'm not just gonna be quiet. But so I finished, and I was always that person who always had something to say about it. So I think that is important. Both, I personally, it's the same thing. People ask me, it's like, how do you identify yourself as, African or African American? I mean, and my answer is always like, when we, go for a job application, it's only one category, it's African, African American, so we identify the same way. And even when we go out in their society, in schools, when we're out there, when people see me, until I start talking, they can start, they can hear my accent. But otherwise, they'll be like, okay, she'll see me, they'll be like, oh, she's Black. So it's important, I think, even like you're saying, all of us, when we're, in education system, or just, different cultures, or whatever, arts, whatever we're doing, it's important to educate and contribute to those, and explain ourselves. So thank you so much. And thank you, Kakayasa. That was a good question. I think we need to have a whole conversation. That was a lot there. Thank you so much. And maybe I think after Kakayase was that Napombe Nakadori coming. You're welcome, please. Thank you.
Asante sana. Thank you so much. So, Professor, I have a 3, a 3 for you as well. I'm going to try to do this really, really quickly. So, and you can do it in whatever order. I'm fine with that. I was really hoping you were going to tell us a little bit about that research that you had done and help us to understand a little bit about the African deep thought, or the African perspective, as as you suggest that it should be used for learning, especially with Mzee Mlanzi. I don't know if I got that right, but, or no, it was Mzee Yasini, okay, who was concerned about education. So I didn't hear you mention anything about your specific work. And since you've done that and you've done the research, maybe you can help us, and that will help me understand better, as well as maybe address the prior question. That's 1. 2, I know that it's ridiculous, but I've been dealing with it, and I'm so glad that you're here, because I hope you have an answer for me to use when I'm facing people. So there's this whole movement right now among a certain facet of us, what I'll call chocolate people, where they have this notion that we weren't brought here, we were here, and all this other kind of stuff. Now, I wasn't alive at the time. I believe the research. I've done my work, I've done the history. I know that there wasn't a slave trade, and I know where we came from and all of that. And even you can do any kind of DNA test and trace back, like you said. However, there's this whole group that's all, no, we're indigenous to this country and whatever. I don't have an answer for them. So I'm hoping you have some kind of an answer when you face some of these kinds of people. And that goes kind of into my next question. So I think it's unfortunate that there are some, not all, but there is a subset of us who are from the motherland who come here and don't understand that there are opportunities afforded to even foreign Africans that are not afforded to African Americans who are the descendants of slaves. And so there's this kind of overarching theory that if I can come from another country and I look like you and I can get the business loan and I can get this and I can get that, why didn't you, who were already here before I got here, take advantage of that? And so the reason why I'm asking you about how we kind of dispel that is because I've talked to some people during Black History Month presentations and so forth who say that they doubt that we would be able to be successful at a bus boycott now. you know, that we don't really have a centralized figure like a Martin Luther King, a Dr. King, or a Malcolm X, or anything that people follow. And I was wanting to ask you, do you think that we will or we can join, this kind of goes into that other part of that other question, not only the African Americans here in the States who are the descendants of slaves, but also those who are coming from across, or those who are on the motherland already? Do you think that we can unify? Do you think that I'm wrong, that we could get together and do have a successful, like a Montgomery boycott type movement? So yeah, so those are my 3 questions.
All right. So you just want to, you know, all right. Each one of those is a dissertation.
Okay.
But I'll try to keep it short. Let me address the second one first.
Okay.
All right. And that is those who are segments of our population who, you know, say that you know, we're not from Africa. You know, Black folks was already here in the Western Hemisphere. We're the original Native Americans, these sorts of things. And I've been hearing this for years. And I have no problems, you know, having that conversation with people. Some of them can get a little belligerent, and I'm like, okay, you got to slow your roll and just, you know, have a conversation, you know, but as long as we can have a good conversation, I'm fine with it. But the conversation seems to scuttle when I start asking for information, when I start asking for evidence. So what I do is I never try to, you know, discredit. I try to reaffirm, hey, that sounds interesting. I'd love to hear more. Can you give me some, you know, and some primary sources, you know, and that normally they generally, in my experience, just go back to like the same 1 or 2, maybe 3 sources but they can't tell me where that information came from. Okay. But what I'll do is I'll do my best to keep okay, well, hey, you seem to know more about this than I do. So if you look into this a little bit further and find some, like, you know, please let me know, because I want to know, you know. So I try to do it like that. I put it back on them. Okay. You know, 1, if this is your position, you should be informed about it. And 2, if this is your position and you're informed about it, then please let me know. But until then, I'm gonna keep pushing with, you know, with what I have, you know. So I try not to be antagonistic about it. I try to be, you know, encouraging and reaffirming, and go back and look into it more deeply. Okay. You know, that's my approach with some of this. And some of them, you know, don't like, you know, what I've, you know, when I put it back on them. And I'm like, it's okay. You don't have to like it. You know, you just got to come with it if you go want me to entertain the, you know, any further. So does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not gonna get all bent out of shape about all it. You know, hey, there's a lot of information out there around the world that we still don't know. So I'm okay with the fact that there's stuff out there that I'm not familiar with. I'm okay with the fact there may be things that you know that I don't know. The older I get, the more I know I don't know what I think I know. And if there's a lot more to know, I'm okay with that. But you got to come correct if you want to challenge me. And so I just put it back, you know, just like that. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much. I needed that. Thank you.
So let me answer your third question second. And that is, can we unify? The answer is yes. Okay. The answer is yes. And I think we have to be optimistic to be able to do the work that we're doing. Right? That optimism, I think, is embedded in our work. I think the hope of better days ahead has allowed us or assisted us in getting us through the worst of times. I think these are different times. I don't think they're the worst of times, but I do think they are different times. I do believe that certain struggles were more apparent at earlier times than they are now. Like, we see them, but, you know, so to your point about the Montgomery bus boycott, that was, people could come together because it was a common, this is what we all know is a problem and we got to do something about this. Whereas now there's a lot on our table. Whereas I hate to put it this way, but it almost kind of seems like things may have been simpler. And I've even heard some of the veterans of our movement, both of the civil rights and Black Power, actually say that I think things were easier to deal with then than they are now. Given all that they went through, these are those veterans, those veteran freedom fighters saying, I think we have it harder today than we did then, right? So, but I am optimistic. And one of the things that allows me to continue to be optimistic is, you know, groups like this, people like Namtasha and Ikaweba Bunting, you know, who I'm a student of his, and and he always has a special place in my heart, and I'll tell you why. Yes, I'm his former student, but more importantly, or I guess I'll say more importantly, but part of that importance is that he's born and raised in Compton just like me. I grew up down the block and around the corner from where he grew up. And I graduated from the same institution he graduated from. He has spent his adult life doing exactly what you're asking. And I don't know anyone else who worked with Nyerere. I know no one else. That is that, right? So the way in which I look at Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, and then the respect that I have for Dr. Bunting, and there's a close connection right there. Like I'm a phone call away from someone who worked with Nyerere, right? That matters to me. That is encouraging to me. And one of the things that he said in the very, it wasn't like the first class, but in that first course, one of the things that he said was, he says, you know, he says, when I first got to Tanzania, we were talking about building a nation. He says, we're talking about building a nation. And so we got a diversity of people, different ethnic groups, different languages. You know, we had people who were gay and lesbian. We had people who were different religions. We had people who were different. And he's like, but you can't build a nation by excluding people out of the conversation because all of them are Tanzanian. So how do we build a nation that is inclusive of all of us as Tanzanians, right? And him, again, speaking as an African born and raised in the United States, right? Who goes and assists in that. So someone like Dr. Bunting kind of embodies, like literally embodies, you know, the answer to that question, right? So continued conversations like this, continued Pan-African congresses, you know, on a institutionally, right? And I think one of the things that I think that many African Americans can do better at is taking, I don't say take advantage, it sounds wrong, is see our continental African brothers and sisters who are here residing in the States now as a resource. There are resources that we can offer from the States. There's resources that that those who are born and raised, or maybe a generation or two removed from the continent who are in the States now, bring something else to the table. Right. And so I'm thinking about in the 80s and 90s, and we were doing a lot of rites of passage programs, right? We were attempting to look back to Africa and draw upon some of those practices to help our youth in these rites of passage programs and things like that. Well, now we have, it's like in places here like Los Angeles, in places like in New York and DC, where we have I mean, concentrations of continental Africans, different populations, right? Taking advantage of some of those, and draw upon, again, in the spirit of Sankofa, right? Draw upon the cultural resources that we have right here. But part of that goes back to another component, and then I'm gonna get to the African deep thought. This is the last thing I'll say about that, then I'll get to the African deep thought.
Okay.
Is that for those of us on both sides of the Atlantic, the information that we have about each other leaves us apart if we're not mindful, if we're not careful. So here I'm going to speak from my own experience, right? Speak from my own experience. When I was in Ghana in 2000, and I was speaking to one of the brothers at the Ghanaian brother at the University of Ghana at Legon, and he was sharing, because I asked him, I said, well, what do y'all learn about us in the States? Like, he was like, yeah, you know, they told us about slavery and it was bad, but Dr. King fixed it all. I'm like, oh, shoot. that's what y'all learning, huh? That's okay, right? And then I started watching, you know, I'm in Ghana and I'm watching TV. Channel O was the station to watch. One, because it was in English, you know, and then also there was some programming that many of us could relate to, right? But I remember watching the Ananla Lewis show. I remember watching rap videos from the States. I'm talking about Tupac, Biggie, Westside Connect, Lil Kim, all of that. And then I remember the last time I was in Ghana, that had to have been in 2004. The movie Soul Plane came out. And I, to this day, I still haven't watched Soul Plane because it came out when I was in Ghana, and some of the folks wanted to go watch it. I'm like, I am not going to Ghana to watch Soul Plane. Not gonna happen, right? And so I connected what the brother from the University of Ghana told me. Everything is fixed now. Then I look at the representation of African Americans on TV in Ghana. It helped me to understand how I could get off the airplane and be greeted by brothers and sisters on the street vendors and stuff. Hey, you know, where are you from? California. Oh, really? West Side? And, you know, doing the whole thing and threw up the W, you know, all of that, right? You know, what's up, my N, and all these. I'm like, hey, I didn't come to Africa to get called no N. I could have stayed in Compton and got that, you know, term of endearment or not. I wasn't expecting that, right? But when I started thinking about what they were being taught, and then what I was able to see the representation. Oh, also, I can't leave this out. We were watching Cops in Fort Worth, Texas. Cops in different, like, so you know how, you know, the treatment of Black folks on Cops, right? And I'm like, oh my God, like, you're taught everything is all cool now, but this is the representation of Black folks. But then you come to the States, why would you want to associate with us then? I started making those connections in my mind. Then I started thinking about what we learned about Africa, because you called me an African when I was coming up in the 80s. We'd be fighting. Nobody wanted to be an African. This is the drought in Somalia, and all those images are on the TV of these, you know, starving Africans and the big old, you know, stomachs from malnutrition and all these other sorts of things. But this is what I'm getting. I haven't been taught about African independence and African sovereignty. I've been taught about, you know, huts and, you know, running around naked and, you know, playing with monkeys, you know, maybe Tarzan and Jane, you know, but then the white folk, right? So I started connecting this misinformation, right, that we were getting about ourselves. And it spoke volumes to me. And so I think, again, that's in part one of the things that keeps me going, is to not succumb to that misinformation.
Okay.
So there's enough of us to know that the distortions are occurring on both sides of the Atlantic, but we have to figure out creative ways of popularizing the misunderstanding so that we can dismiss them. And we have to figure out creative ways of emphasizing the accurate information and reaffirming each other in our connections, i.e. this program here today. So I'm going to answer your first question last.
Okay.
African deep thought. Here I draw upon the works of Jacob Crothers. Jacob Crothers wrote, do I have it right here? Jacob Crothers wrote a book, I have it right here. It's called Medu-Neter, Divine Speech, a historical reflection of the African deep thought from the time of pharaohs to the present, right? I don't know if you can see that. It's in the
Kind of, sort of. Oh yes, thank you.
There we go.
Okay.
It's,
Uh-huh.
I'll put something in the chat for you in a second.
Okay.
So Jacob Crothers is a philosopher. He's a philosopher, and what he's looking for, what he's interested in, is a different way of thinking about philosophy that is rooted in and grounded in African culture. This is important because the philosophy that many of us are introduced to is built upon Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. Now, I have no problems with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in and of itself. My issue with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, I just put a link in the chat that has the information. My issue is the presentation of Western philosophy, i.e. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, as if other people around the world do not have their own great minds and great thinkers and approaches to understanding. That's my problem. That's not an issue with Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle in and of themselves. That is an issue with the way in which the educational system and beyond has projected Western thought as the pinnacle of intellect in the world, as if Africans, Japanese, Mesoamerican, so on and so forth, don't have their own sages, philosophers, great thinkers, and contributions to the world. This is important because the way in which people make sense of the world is rooted in their culture. Thinking is a cultural process. And that's one of the things that Jacob Crothers and other folks like Asa Hilliard, also talks about, is that in Malefi Asante, right? That thinking is cultural. We think in a cultural context. So critical thinking, then, in order to think critically, if we only stay with Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, and the Western philosophy that derives from their contributions, then all we're doing is rehashing Western philosophy in different forms. What Crothers has done in his introduction of African deep thought is saying, if we look at African culture and African cultural values, and for him, he's starting with ancient Egypt as a point of departure. It's a different foundation now. I'll give you one quick example because I don't want to go off on this long tangent. Plato separates the mind, the body, and the soul in his conceptualization of the self. The mind, the body, and the soul. He separates them, placing the mind, the rational thought, above the soul, above the spirit, above the body. Crothers, Marimba Ani, many others say that when we take a look at the self, drawing upon the best of African cultural values, there's no separation between the mind, the body, and the soul. So that means then that very point of departure on something that basic has profound implications on how we make sense of and understand whatever it is that we're thinking about.
Okay.
Right. And so I draw upon Crothers, Asa Hilliard, and others, a conceptualization of African deep thought. And I think about it in the context of critical thinking and say that to have an African-centered approach to critical thinking, we have to operate from African cultural values as a starting point. And so in the piece that should be coming out, so I did Putting Some Soul into Critical Thinking that came out in 2020. And then the piece that I have coming out hopefully next month on African proverbs, riddles, and narratives. I don't say folktales. I say narratives. But I say not all of us are going to be just drop everything we're doing and go back and study African culture and study African philosophy. That's not going to happen, right? On a practical level. What we can do on a practical level is introduce ourselves and our students, because I'm saying this to other educators, to African proverbs, to riddles, to narratives, these stories. And we could be at least a little bit here and there, just little bits. We could be reintroduced, right, to a different value system that hopefully will challenge the way in which we're thinking, and hopefully shift us to a more holistic approach to thinking about the self and the world. So that's my short answer, to that. I hope that answer makes sense. I hope I answered all three of your questions.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It totally made sense, and I appreciate it. You were talking about our unity. We here, a Tanzanian community, where we registered as a nonprofit. So we try to have events throughout the year, barbecue, Independence Party. So, and I really hope you can come to one of those at least. But in all these events, we try to, what we're showcasing, what we're presenting, whether it's a play or, it's our culture. And we try to get people from outside, not just Tanzanians. We call Tanzanian and friends. So even our friends, and some of us here are married to African Americans from here. So, unity is important, like what you were saying. So I totally agree with that. And I hope you can, when the time comes, and either that Natasha or Glenn will let you know, we'll send you the invite, and hope you can come to one of our events this year. And so thank you so much. Those were great questions. Kakayasa, Pombe, anybody else who like to, I know we're running here on time, but any final thoughts, or if you have anything to share, if you like to say anything, I know Archie and other folks, Beresh, if you want to jump in and say anything, you're more than welcome, maybe. Glenn, we can't hear you. Were you saying something? You're muted.
I say I saw Ruth's hand. I don't know if she changed her mind or.
Oh, okay. We have, which is it? Was it Dr. Ogot or Sister Ruth? There's two Ruth. Kariboni.
I actually don't know which one.
This is Beresha. Thank you so much for a great session. I really learned a lot about Pan Africanism, and we'll welcome you back to talk to the group again. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Beresha. Yeah, any final round, anything more?
Hi, Ruth here. Thank you so much, Dr. Keith, for very informative piece. Actually, I'll go. I just checked into your for the piece that is released out. I'll buy and share it with the young folks. We need to teach our young folks, especially the kids of African descent and born here, to know our culture and the roots. It's very important. I don't know. I just came in. I had one or things. Yeah, so I was not able to ask the question. But so often there's this myth that we people from the diaspora from Africa, we look down upon the African American here, which to me doesn't make sense, because at my place of work, I get treated the same way African American is treated. We go through the same torture, mentally, the trauma. So this thing that we look upon, we look down on the people here, doesn't make sense. When I see a Black person, it doesn't matter wherever part of the world they're coming from. It's either a sister, a brother. To the young ones, I am either a mother, a mentor. So I think we need to have these conversations, the African diaspora and the Africans here, to see how we need to build each other instead of being separated. At times it's just politics trying to separate us so that we cannot work together as African community to build each other, and mostly to build back home. Because that's where the problem is, build back home, all these politics and cultures. So thank you so much. And we're looking forward to you and anybody who can come and share. We need to build a community whereby we build each other as Black people. It doesn't matter whether you're from Africa or from here, but as Black people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was good. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Anybody else you'd like to say something? Anybody else? Going once, twice, one more time? All right, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you so much, Dr. Keith. Thank you so much. I'll let Glenn give maybe say last words here, but I just wanted to thank you on behalf of the community and thank everybody who joined today. We appreciate your time. I know, but you know, it's good to take time out and have these conversations, and you know, I've gained so much in just such a little time here that we have spoken, you know, from these conversations. So thank you so much again, everybody who took out of their busy day, took time. And thank you, Dr. Keith. And hopefully we'll see each other sometime this year. And yeah, I'll bring it back to, you have something to say to the non-comment?
A question, just a question. The slides, Dr. Keith, are you sharing? I know we saw them, but I'm not going to remember all of that information off the top of my head. Are you sending us your presentation, the slides? Or is it, I don't know, how do we access what you've shared with us?
So two things, and thank you for that. One, I believe that it was recorded. So we have the recording, but if you want the slides, I can email it to Glenn, and we can go from there as Glenn wants to distribute it. And then also I was thinking, I don't know why I didn't say this earlier, with regards to, because there's a lot of conversation here around education. I wrote, as I shared earlier, I put this in the chat, building the basics. And so I just put a link to it here. And so one of the earlier comments about how building those skills that some of our students need, right? It's lacking. Clearly it's lacking, which is exactly why I wrote this handbook. And so the target audience is for late high school, early college, to build some of those skills, right, that we need to be to maximize the learning experience. So I wanted to say thank you for the invitation to come and share a few words, you know, with you. Glenn, it was good corresponding with you. Thank you. And you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again.
Thank
Asante
you.
sana.
Thank you, Asante.
Before the doctor leaves, I have a message from my boss. And he asked me to read it. So here we go. Okay, from President of SOCAL. On behalf of the members of the SOCAL Tanzania community, I want to thank you, Dr. Keith, for your insightful presentation today. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today on the very important topic of Pan-African. We truly appreciate people like you who are willing to give their time and talent to enrich the lives of other people. The message ends there. So he stepped out, but he asked me to read that to you.
Well, thank you. Please send, thank you for reading it, and please send, my my thanks as well.
Thank you. I know also that Namtasha had to go to Black History session at the library.
Yes.
So we thank her for her time, and we thank her for reaching out to you, actually. Yeah, but I'll talk to her later. But thank you so much, everybody. I think that will end our conversation for today. I'll go ahead and stop recording here. If you guys want to hang out and chit chat, let me stop recording real